And now I give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to refer my statement to Resolution 4-68-2.31. Mr. President, the Iranian theocracy has presented a resolution that is riddled with hypocrisy. By putting forward this resolution, Iran seeks to ride the wave towards international legitimacy. But Iran's aspirations cannot be allowed to drown out the cries of its people who are victims of a regime that pretends to be progressive, but in truth is tragically regressive. Iran calls for nations to denounce violence and extremism could easily fill the pages of an absurdist fiction. I would suggest that the Iranians borrow a phrase from the London Tube and caution readers of this resolution to mind the gap between the document's aspirations and the situation in Iran. Mr. President, not long ago, the Washington Post published an article written by Shirin Ebadi, the 2003 Nobel Peace Prize winner. She wrote about Iran's use of torture, media censorship, and the persecution of religious minorities. While world leaders congratulated themselves on the interim deal reached in Geneva, Ebadi described the scene in Tehran where, and I quote, "The lifeless body of a young man hung from a crane in a bleak public square, spreading fear among Iranians who suffer the world's highest per capita rate of executions." Today's resolution implores nations to ensure a life free of violence for their people, while fully respecting their human rights. Yet Iran is one of the world's worst human rights abusers. This is a regime that hangs gays, stones women, imprisons journalists, and executes political opponents. Mr. President, reading through a document before us, it wasn't clear to me if I was reading a UN resolution or President Rouhani's New Year resolution. After all, Iran is the world's primary sponsor of terror, responsible for the murder of thousands of innocent civilians, from Bangkok to Burgas and Buenos Aires. It is also the principal supplier of weapons in the Middle East, igniting conflicts and inflaming sectarian divides. Iran continues to lend its financial, military, and political support to murderous groups like Hezbollah and Hamas. These terrorist organizations have dispatched hundreds of suicide bombers, planted thousands of bombs, and fired tens of thousands of missiles on innocent civilians. Just this weekend, President Rouhani provided another example of Iranian hypocrisy when he tweeted, and I quote, "Countries that provide arms and training to terrorists have created crises in the region and will eventually be caught up in this support of terrorism." End of quote. Can you believe this? When I read this, I thought I was reading pages from Alice in Wonderland, not Rouhani's Twitter feed. It reminded me of a serial killer lecturing on all of us on the sanctity of life. Mr. President, today's resolution also calls on nations to recognize one another in a display of tolerance. Iran demonstrated this so-called tolerance last week when it took the floor in the General Assembly and refused to recognize Israel, a fellow member state in the United Nations. Nonetheless, Israel has joined the consensus to demonstrate its support for the ideals in this resolution and for the Iranian people. In doing so, Israel is putting people before politics in the hope that others will follow our example. The resolution sets the bar high. And now it is up to the international community to ensure that Iran measures up. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Israel for his statement.